The ceremony of the cranes, which commemorates the atomic bombing of Hiroshima in 1945, has been observed in the Lindale Park Peace Garden in Minneapolis since 1985. The centerpiece of this event is telling the story of Sadako Sasaki, an atomic bomb survivor who folded over 1,000 paper cranes in her effort to get well. The ceremony includes a moment of silence at 8:15, the time when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. St. Paul artist Caprice Glazer designed the Spirit of Peace sculpture in the Peace Garden. On each of the boulders around the statue is one of the steps to folding an origami crane. The sculpture, which sits on a limestone boulder, has 42 words of peace inscribed under a ball or globe representing the earth. At the top of the sculpture, the crane is flying to bring peace to the world. Elaine Wynn and her granddaughter Sage Curry Wynn will now tell Sadako's story.
Hi, my name is Sage, and I'm here with my grandma Elaine. And today we're going to be telling the story of Sadako and the 1,000 Cranes. This is a story that we've told together for a few years now. My grandma has been telling it for a lot longer than I have, but it's a really important story about peace, and a story that is still relevant even today, even so many years later.
In Japan, it is said that cranes will bring you long life and much good luck. And when the cranes rise above the city and the countryside, it looks as though 1,000,000 golden suns burst in the sky. But that day, August 6, 1945, it looked as though 1,000,000 golden suns burst, but it was not the cranes, it was Thunderbolt. It was Thunderbolt, the first atomic bomb, the first nuclear bomb to be dropped on a human city. It was in Hiroshima, in Japan, and bricks and boards flew through the air. There was a bright, bright light when the bomb exploded, and people who looked, many of them never could see again, and people ran through the streets. Bricks and boards were flying. There were fires everywhere, and people said, "What was it?" And those who knew told the ones who did not. And they went through the streets crying out for water, water, anything to cool the burning of their skin. People helped each other. People came out and they made Red Cross stations everywhere in the city. The hospitals had been destroyed, and many doctors and nurses had died, and they helped each other. 2 weeks after, still many people died every day. And yet, people kept going on, making each day one to help more people. Then the other unusual thing happened. Flowers began to bloom. Flowers, pink and lavender and white flowers growing in the parts of Hiroshima like no one had ever seen before. It was the strangest mutation of life in the middle of all of that dying.
Sadako Sasaki was 2 years old the day that the bomb fell on her city. She lived with her family in a house, not quite at ground zero, but close enough by where they felt the blast. The story actually goes that when the bomb struck, Sadako's mom couldn't find her and wasn't sure where she was. She looked around in the house and then outside, and then found that Sadako had been blasted through the window. She found her on the ground almost miraculously, with no injuries. But that day was still a very dark one for Sadako's family. Her grandmother had died in the bomb blast. And Sadako, only 2 years old, was too young to recall that day exactly, or to truly understand the gravity of what had happened to her family and her city. It's hard for me to imagine what it must have been like, growing up in a city that had been struck by such a horrible tragedy, and to see the city slowly rebuild, and slowly life try to come back to normal. That is what Sadako experienced growing up. From a young age, Sadako found a passion, and that passion was running. She would go for jogs around the neighborhood, and it made her feel safe and in control. It made her feel hopeful. As she grew up, she would run around the neighborhood, she would run around at school with the other kids and challenge them to races. And eventually, she even joined the relay team. She loved running with her friends, and she even dreamed that maybe one day she would go on to be a famous runner and compete in the Olympics. One day, when Sadako was 12 years old, she was running in a relay race with her friends from school. When her time came to run, she felt as if something was wrong. She didn't really have the energy to go forward. She wondered, did I not get enough for breakfast this morning? Did I not get enough sleep last night? What could be wrong? But before Sadako could answer those questions, she passed out. When she woke up, she glanced around to find herself in a room, which she quickly realized was the hospital. She realized that this was the wing of the hospital for people with atom bomb sickness, or as we today would call leukemia, caused by the long-lasting effects of the bomb dropped on her city. And Sadako knew that most people at the time who got atom bomb sickness didn't survive very long. She sat in her hospital bed, and in the days following, she visited with her family. She still felt deeply sad, almost hopeless. But that all changed one day. That was the day that Sadako's best friend Chizuko came to the hospital. Now Chizuko waltzed right into the wing of the hospital where Sadako was, with a smile on her face, almost like a bright beam of light. Chizuko wasn't going to act sad. She walked right up to Sadako and said, "Sadako, we read the greatest story in class today. You really would have liked it. It was a legend that says that if a person folds 1,000 paper cranes, they'll have good luck. Sadako, maybe you should try that. Maybe it would help bring you good luck to get over your illness." And Sadako, of course, was skeptical. She said, "Chizuko, there's no way." But Chizuko was persistent, and together, they folded the first 2 cranes. Now, even after Chizuko left that day, Sadako continued to fold cranes. She found that it brought her a type of peace. She kept folding and folding as a way to pass the hours in the hospital. Soon, the cranes started piling up on her bed, on the table next to her, and the kids would come in every day after school and count Sadako's cranes. 100, 200, she was still folding. They would come in, and even her brother made her a mobile so she could watch the cranes fly above her bed in the hospital. The kids continued to count. 300, 400, Sadako was still folding.
And as she kept folding the cranes, they piled up even more. One day, Sadako woke up and she was too tired to fold the cranes. The next day, she was still very tired. She held up a half-folded crane and she said, I'm going to write peace on your wings so people would know we should never have this happen again. The next day, Sadako Sasaki died in her hospital room. The kids came. They came and they counted the cranes. She had folded 1,000 cranes and started over again. She folded 651 cranes the second time, and the kids talked about her. Oh, that Sadako, how could she do that? Oh, they loved telling the story about her, and they wanted everyone to know it. So they not only counted the cranes, they started raising money, really only with talking to other kids and having people put coins into cans. They got $20,000 American money, that amount of money, to build a statue so that no one would ever forget Sadako. It's still there today. It's a beautiful mountain is in the statue. It's the Mount Hooray, the Statue of Paradise. And it's right next to the big museum, the museum that tells the stories, and the stories are so sad. And then on that platform where there's the mountain, kids send cranes. They send chains of cranes, and they send their pictures, and they send writings of what they want to see happen in the world. And every child in Japan goes to that statue one time in their school career, so they know, everyone knows about it. One time, a number of years after Sadako statue had been built, Walter Enloe was the principal of the school in Hiroshima, and a new group of kids from Hiroshima decided they wanted to make it even bigger. And so they said, we should start a crane club, and the crane club could let everybody know what happened. Well, they got cranes of all colors folded, and they went around the world, and they told kids everywhere. And to this day, the kids send cranes from everywhere in the world. People hear about it. Oh, that's good. I could do that. I could fold cranes, kids and adults. But they send them there to the statue. And the people who work in the park around the statue, for many years, they've been taking, when they get to be too high, there's too many of them, they would take them down. They would take them down and throw them away. But Hiroshima, a few years ago, decided that was the wrong thing to do with the cranes and the letters from the children. They bought a big piece of ground, or someone gave it to them, I don't know which, but they now put all the cranes and all of the writings and the pictures and everything on the field. It's about as big as a football field, and the rain comes and the sand blows, and it just kind of melts into the earth eventually. So there's nothing left of it. And they continue to send them all the time. Now, there is at the top of the statue, I didn't tell you about that part. At the top, there's a girl, and she is holding in her hands, outstretched, a crane. At the base of the statue, there's some words. This are
Right.
prepared to establish peace in the world.
Our keynote speaker this year is peace activist and scholar from St. Paul, Jay Qualley. Jay will explain the title of his speech, 100 Seconds to Midnight, and talk about the current state of nuclear issues.
My name is Jay Qualley. I'm a member of the Hiroshima Nagasaki Committee. When the first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, there was a lot of celebrating on the American side because the bomb worked, the war would end shortly, and there wouldn't be an invasion. When the second bomb was dropped in Nagasaki, the reaction changed. People had a great deal of dismay that what kind of world were we going into where cities would be bombed regularly. Ever since, there have been two parallel trends. One has been to build bigger bombs and proliferate in more nations, and the other one has been to reduce the bombs and disarm them. Two ominous developments in the early 1950s were the time when the Russians obtained the bomb. There were spies at Los Alamos. This meant that more countries would get them, and it would eventually get to the 9 countries we have today. The second development was the building of the H-bomb, or the Super, by Edward Teller. You may have seen the telephone photo image of the H-bomb in the Pacific from 100 miles away. Shows a huge mushroom cloud 200 times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. One of these H-bombs dropped over the IDS tower would incinerate all of the Twin Cities inside the 494-694 loop within a minute. This can never be allowed to happen. Two important treaties to rein these powerful bombs in were 1963, the Limited Test Ban Treaty of John Kennedy. This took the above-ground testing down underground and prevented thousands of tests which would spread radiation above ground. In 1970, there was the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This has limited the proliferation to the 9 nations. It has not been particularly effective at disarmament, however. Since that time, 80% of the nuclear weapons in the world have been dismantled. We've gone from 68,000 to about 13,400 today. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists set up the Doomsday Clock to let the world know how close we were to nuclear war. Back 30 and 40 years ago, it was generally 20 minutes to midnight or 15 minutes to midnight. A few years ago, they set it up to 2 minutes to midnight, and now it's at 100 seconds to midnight, a very dangerous situation. The reason is that this is the disturbing trends in the last several years. 8 years ago, Obama approved a $1 trillion modernization of the nuclear arsenal to take place over 30 years. This was a huge disappointment. 2 years ago, Putin announced the development of a new hypersonic missile. Russia and the United States figured we had to develop our own, so it started a new arms race to get this new hypersonic missile. In the last few years, Trump has pulled out of several important nuclear agreements. The Iran nuclear deal, the International Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, and he may not extend the New START Treaty next year. He has also proposed resuming above-ground nuclear testing. This has been getting a lot of pushback from Congress and scientists. A hopeful development for disarmament happened in 2017. 122 nations at the United Nations adopted the treaty to prevent nuclear weapons. 40 countries have ratified this treaty so far. When 10 more ratify it, it will become international law, hopefully next year. Then 2/3 of the countries in the world will ban nuclear weapons and put pressure on the 9 nations that have them. The 9 that have them will then become outlaws. This will be an important milestone in the drive to abolition of these weapons. Now, what you can do in this situation is to educate yourself about nuclear weapons. I recommend reading the last 3 chapters of the book, The Doomsday Machine by Daniel Ellsberg. When you contact Congress, be emphatic. We want to oppose the modernization of the nuclear arsenal. We oppose 400 new ballistic missiles at a cost of $85 billion. We oppose the new $10 billion Trident submarine killer boat, which carries the equivalent of 2,000 Hiroshima bombs. We don't need all this death and destruction. We need our resources to help our people in a time of domestic crisis. We also need to suggest to our legislators to support the UN treaty. So far, 9 members of the House have supported it, including Betty McCollum and Ilhan Omar from the Twin Cities. And we must continue to break down the barriers between people and the propaganda and the idea that other countries are enemies. 65 years ago, Japanese and Americans formed the St. Paul Nagasaki Sister City Committee. There have been exchanges, many of students and gifts between the 2 cities, like cherry trees and bells. Hundreds of wonderful friendships have been formed. 2 years ago, a delegation of 50 Japanese came to St. Paul. They were the nicest people you'd ever want to meet. So we must continue to form bonds of friendship between our cities and our people, so we won't have the propaganda and adversarial ideas of bombing each other or going to war. Thank you.
The local chapter of Veterans for Peace made their own bells to ring at an important ceremony. 11 people made 11 bells in honor of the original armistice of War to End All Wars on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. Once the bell has rung, we will observe a moment of silence.
We have folded cranes for peace. We have recommitted ourselves to peacemaking through reflection on the past, action in the present, and hope for the future.
35 years ago, people all over the United States made panels for the peace ribbon to wrap around the Pentagon. Today, we have some members of the Peace Ribbon Minnesota 2020 project with us.
Led by the ribbons, we walk down the hill to the iconic Peace Garden Bridge. We stop to remember those who died due to the atomic bomb, and those who have died of violence in our cities, and those who have died during the coronavirus pandemic, including our friend, Father Jogues Epple.